On the morning of April 2, 1907, salvors off the coast of Cornwall prepared to carry out a plan that sounded almost absurd. A White Star liner was stranded on rocks below the Lizard, and the only way to save most of her was to destroy part of her deliberately. The ship was SS Suevic, a large passenger and cargo steamer that had spent less than 6 years in service. Her bow was trapped so firmly on Maenheere Rocks that repeated attempts to pull the vessel free had failed. But the after part of the ship, including her engines, boilers, and much of her accommodation, remained valuable and comparatively sound. So the salvors stopped trying to save Suevic as one ship. Instead, they prepared to save only the part that could still move. A temporary bulkhead had already been built inside the hull behind the damaged region. Cargo had been removed, but not all of it. Some weight was deliberately left aboard so the surviving section would sit properly in the water after separation. Wooden decking had been opened where necessary to expose the steel structure below. Then came the cutting. Explosive charges were arranged through the ship along a carefully chosen line. The work did not amount to one enormous blast. The salvors were using explosives as a tool, breaking the structural connections that still tied the stranded bow to the section they intended to recover. When the separation was complete, roughly 370 feet of Suevic came away from the rocks. Her original bow stayed behind. The larger surviving section remained afloat. Then came one of the strangest sights in early 20th century salvage. With tugs assisting and her own machinery still working, the bowless Suevics began moving stern first toward Southampton. The explosions made the operation memorable, but they were only the visible climax of a decision that had taken days to reach. To understand why anyone would deliberately cut a valuable ocean liner in two, the story has to go back 17 days, to the night Suevic approached the Cornish coast. Suevic had been built by Harland and Wolff in Belfast for the Oceanic Steam Navigation Company, better known as the White Star Line. She was launched in 1900 and entered service the following year, joining the company's route between Britain and Australia. She carried passengers, but cargo mattered just as much. Her holds were built for a trade that moved meat, butter, and other produce from Australia to Britain. On the voyage that would end at the Lizard, she carried a large general cargo that included frozen meat and butter. That cargo would soon matter for several very different reasons. It represented value to be recovered, weight to be removed, and eventually, in part, weight to be deliberately left aboard. In early 1907, Suevic left Melbourne on another voyage home. She called at Cape Town and Tenerife before making for Plymouth and the ports farther north. On board were 382 passengers, 141 crew members, and a stowaway, more than 500 people in all. By the evening of March 17th, the ship was approaching the southwestern tip of England. The weather was not the violent storm sometimes added to later retellings. The official inquiry described a dark, hazy night with drizzling rain and a fresh southwesterly breeze. Visibility was poor enough to make judging the ship's position difficult, and the Lizard lighthouse was the key visual reference. Captain Thomas Jones believed he understood where Suevic was in relation to the light. His estimate was wrong. The liner continued toward land at high speed. No timely sounding with the lead was taken to provide another check on depth while the ship's position remained uncertain. Later, the Board of Trade Inquiry criticized those decisions directly. The court concluded that Suevic had been navigated toward the coast without the care the circumstances demanded. It found that Jones had placed too much reliance on his interpretation of the light, had not made sufficient allowance for the distance run and the effect of the tide, and had failed to use the lead when another check on the ship's position was needed. His master's certificate was suspended for 3 months. Those findings remove a convenient explanation for the loss. Suevic was not simply overwhelmed by exceptional weather. The official inquiry treated the grounding as a navigation failure in conditions that required greater caution. At about 27 minutes past 10 that night, Suevic struck Maenheere Rocks. The voyage ended immediately. Her engines were stopped and then put astern, but the ship did not come free. The forward part of the hull had ridden hard onto the reef. From that moment, every attempt to save the vessel would be shaped by the same fact. The bow was not merely damaged, it was physically held by the rocks. The first priority had nothing to do with saving steel. It was getting people off the ship. Lifeboat crews from communities around the Lizard worked through a rescue that lasted for hours. Boats from Cadgwith, Coverack, the Lizard, and Porthleven took part. The Royal National Lifeboat Institution credits its crews with saving 456 people during the operation, including many children and infants. The total number aboard Suevic was higher because other boats and craft were involved in removing people from the stranded liner. What matters most is the outcome. More than 500 people had been carried into danger by a navigation error, and no life was lost in the grounding and evacuation. Once the human emergency had been resolved, Suevic became a different kind of problem. She was not sitting in deep water with a hole that could simply be patched. She was not resting gently on mud, waiting for a higher tide. Her forward hull was locked onto a rocky reef, but the ship was also far from a total loss. Behind the damaged bow were her engines, boilers, accommodation, and a long section of hull that had not been destroyed by the grounding. For White Star, there was a strong reason to recover as much of that investment as possible. The first plan was conventional: lighten the ship and pull her free. That choice matters because it shows how the salvage developed. No one began with the idea of blasting apart a nearly new liner. As long as Suevic could plausibly be recovered intact, destroying a major section would have made little sense. The extreme solution appeared only after the simpler one had been tested against the physical reality of the reef. Between March 20 and March 27th, steamers, tugs, and lighters worked around Suevic while cargo was removed. Every ton taken out reduced the weight the hull had to support. On a simpler grounding, that might have allowed the ship to rise enough for tugs, engines, and tide to do the rest. Here, it was not enough. Suevic remained fixed to the rocks. The salvors had reached the point that separates an ordinary refloating attempt from an operation people would remember more than a century later. The whole ship could not be moved. But perhaps the whole ship did not need to be moved. The most valuable surviving parts of Suevic were behind the worst damage. Her machinery was aft. Much of the accommodation was aft. Hundreds of feet of useful hull remained behind the section held by the reef. The salvage question therefore changed. Instead of asking how to free the bow, the team could ask whether the stern, machinery spaces, and central hull could survive without it. That answer depended on what happened before the first charge was fired. A ship is not designed to have its forward third removed while sitting in the sea. Cutting through the hull would create a new end where there had never been one. If water could enter directly into the surviving section, the operation would replace one grounded wreck with two. So workers built a stout temporary timber bulkhead across the ship behind the damaged area. The purpose was simple. When the bow was gone, the sea still needed to be kept out of the part they wanted to save. Weight created another problem. By then, much of the cargo had already been removed. But contemporary reporting says approximately 2,000 tons were deliberately left aboard. This was not cargo the salvors had forgotten. It helped control the trim of the section that was expected to float away. A vessel's trim is simply the way its weight makes it sit from bow to stern. Removing too much from the wrong place could leave the surviving hull badly balanced in the water. The goal was no longer to make Suevic as light as possible. It was to make the section that would remain as manageable as possible. Workers also had to reach the structure they intended to cut. Wooden decking was removed where necessary to expose the steel below. The separation line had to pass through decks, frames, plating, and other members that made the hull one continuous structure. The charges had to break those connections without needlessly wrecking the afterbody. Blasting began on March 29th. Modern summaries sometimes make the operation sound like a single spectacular detonation in which the bow simply disappeared. The contemporary evidence describes something more deliberate. Explosive charges were placed through the structure and fired electrically as part of a controlled cutting process. The exact number of charges is not securely documented, and later accounts give conflicting figures. What can be said with confidence is that the explosives were distributed along the line where the salvors intended the ship to separate. For several days the work continued. This was the difficult balance at the center of the operation. The connection to the stranded bow had to become weaker, while the surviving hull had to remain useful. The cut had to go far enough to release the afterbody, but the preparations behind it had to keep that section afloat once the last structural connection was gone. The bulkhead, the cargo distribution, and the explosive work were therefore not separate tricks. They were parts of one sequence. First, prepare the section to survive. Then remove the part that could not be saved. On April 2nd, the sequence reached its decisive point. The official inquiry described the surviving afterbody as about 370 feet long. Tugs including Herculaneum, Blazer, Ranger, and Linnet assisted as it was pulled away from the reef. The afterbody remained afloat. Its machinery survived. And for the first time since the grounding, part of Suevic was moving away from Maenheere Rocks. The original bow did not move with it. The image was extraordinary because the separation made the scale of the decision visible. The salvors had not refloated the liner they had found. They had created a new, temporary version of Suevic, one made from whatever the reef had failed to take. Now they had to get that vessel to a shipyard. There was no normal way to navigate in this condition. Suevic no longer had the forward section that gave the ship her normal shape and handling, but the engines and propellers remained at the stern, exactly where they had always been. So the salvaged section used what it still had. With tug assistance, it proceeded stern first toward Southampton. Behind them, the forward section remained where the entire ship had been held only days earlier. Contemporary photographs make the division unmistakable. One image shows the abandoned bow still sitting on the reef, while later photographs show the recovered afterbody in Southampton without it. The two views record the same salvage decision from opposite sides. Cornwall kept the damaged forward part. Southampton received the machinery, accommodation, and most of the hull that the salvors believed could still become a ship again. The contrast was hard to miss. As a complete ship, Suevic could not be dragged backward off the rocks. Once the bow was sacrificed, the surviving section could finally leave. At Southampton, photographs showed just how radical the solution had been. Hundreds of feet of recognizable liner remained intact, but the hull ended abruptly where the forward part should have continued. The machinery spaces were there, the accommodation was there, the working ship was there in pieces of function, but not yet in complete form. At this point, White Star had another decision to make. The company could have treated the afterbody as salvage material. Instead, it ordered a new bow. The contract went to Harland and Wolff, the Belfast yard that had built Suevic in the first place. Only a few years after completing the full liner, the shipyard began constructing another forward section for the same vessel. This was not a small replacement stem or a patch over damaged plating. The new forebody was approximately 212 feet long. It included the stem, holds, deckhouses, and major forward structures. In practical terms, Harland and Wolff was building a substantial fraction of an ocean liner as a separate floating unit. For a time in 1907, Suevic existed in an extraordinary physical state. Her original bow remained wrecked in Cornwall. Her surviving afterbody waited at Southampton. Her replacement bow was being built in Belfast. A popular joke later described her as the longest ship in the world, because her ends were separated by hundreds of miles. It was not a literal record, but it captured the absurd geography of the reconstruction. The real engineering problem was less amusing. Building a new bow to the original drawings was not enough. The surviving ship did not end at a clean factory joint. It ended where salvors had blasted through an existing hull while the vessel sat on a reef. The replacement therefore had to provide enough structure for the damaged end of the old ship to be cut back, prepared, and connected accurately. That made the new bow more than a duplicate of what had been lost. It had to be a replacement designed for a ship that now ended in the wrong place. On October 5, 1907, Harland and Wolff launched the new forebody at Belfast. There was something inherently strange about launching the bow of a ship without the rest of the ship behind it. The structure entered the water as an independent floating object, complete enough to survive the tow, but never intended to operate as a vessel on its own. From Belfast, it was taken to Southampton. By late October, the surviving afterbody and the replacement bow were finally in the same place. The salvage operation now reversed direction. On the reef, the problem had been how to turn one ship into two without losing the valuable section. In Southampton, the problem was how to turn two incomplete structures back into one working ship. The damaged end of the original hull first had to be prepared. Steel distorted by grounding, blasting, and separation could not simply be hidden behind new plating. Irregular material had to be cut back, so the surviving structure presented a usable boundary. Then the replacement bow had to be positioned and aligned. The challenge was not just making the outer hull look continuous. Decks, frames, shell plating, and internal spaces all had to meet in positions that allowed them to work as one structure again. Pipes, fittings, and other systems also had to cross a line that had never existed when Suevic was first built. Later retellings sometimes describe this stage as if the new bow arrived and simply fitted perfectly. That turned skilled reconstruction into a trick. The real achievement was more practical. Harland and Wolff had built the replacement with enough structural allowance to permit final fitting, and the workers at Southampton had enough sound original hull left to make the connection possible. The jagged end of the salvage ship was cut back. The new steel was brought into position. The two sections were joined. The result was not a temporary floating repair. It was again a complete ocean-going ship. By January 1908, less than a year after Suevic struck Maenheere Rocks, the reconstructed liner was ready to return to commercial operation. That return was the real proof that the salvage had worked. Keeping the bowless afterbody afloat on April 2nd had been a remarkable success, but it was only an intermediate one. Towing the section to Southampton was another. Launching the replacement bow in Belfast was another. None of those steps mattered as much as what followed. Suevic went back to sea. She returned to the Australia trade and remained in service for years afterward. Passengers and cargo again crossed oceans aboard a vessel whose forward section had not existed when the original Suevic left Belfast in 1901. Ordinary voyages became the final test of an extraordinary repair. The bow abandoned at the Lizard did not share that future. It remained on the reef and later broke up under the action of the sea. The surviving ship continued. In 1928, Suevic was sold to Norwegian interests and converted into the whale factory vessel Sketteren. Her appearance, ownership, and purpose changed, but the physical result of the 1907 salvage remained inside the ship. The afterbody recovered from Cornwall and the replacement bow built in Belfast continued to travel together. 14 years later, war brought the vessel's second loss. On April 1, 1942, Sketteren was among Norwegian ships attempting to escape Swedish waters and reach the Allies. German forces intervened. Rather than allow the vessel to be captured, her crew scuttled her off the Swedish west coast. This time the ship went to the seabed as one hull. The wreck now lies in roughly 74 meters of water. Modern surveys have found much of it still together, though decades underwater have left the structure heavily corroded, especially toward the stern. In 2021 and 2022, Swedish authorities removed large quantities of oil and oily water from the wreck, along with abandoned fishing gear. That modern work gives Suevic's story an unexpected final layer. In 1907, salvage meant preserving a valuable ship. More than a century later, intervention around the same hull meant reducing the environmental risk left by a wreck. But the strongest physical connection is simpler than that. The steel pulled away from Maenheere Rocks in April 1907 eventually reached the seabed off Sweden 35 years later. The replacement bow built at Belfast went down with it. Today, those two sections remain together. The original bow does not. Suevic's first wreck had forced the salvors to accept a distinction that was brutal but practical. One part of the ship was beyond recovery. The rest was not. They acted on that difference. The old bow stayed on Maenheere Reef. The ship behind it went to Southampton, received a new forward section, and returned to service. For decades, the repair became part of an ordinary working vessel, until war finally ended the second life that the 1907 salvage had made possible. Now, off Sweden, the recovered afterbody and the replacement bow lie together on the seabed. The first time Suevic was wrecked, saving her meant cutting her in two. The second time, there was no third bow.